What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today we're going to be discussing breaking the rules in street photography. We'll be looking at some of my photographs, looking at some of the techniques I use, and understand more clearly why we should break the rules. How can we break the rules, and when should we break the rules? I believe that in order to break the rules, one must have a free mind, a free spirit, somebody who isn't necessarily limited by any beliefs or dogmas or traditions. And ultimately, I find that there is no 1, 2, 3, ABC on how to practice street photography, but one must develop their own game to play when out there on the streets. And so I encourage you to first and foremost, consider the way in which you consume photography, produce photography, and even publish your photography. Are you using Instagram? Are you limited to the four corners of a box? Like me here in this photograph, you see me here in the mirror reflected back within the four corners of that box. And it reminds me of the mental blockage that these platforms like Instagram provide for the individual, where you become limited to the four corners of the grid. And there's something to be said about the way in which sharing your photographs, receiving feedback, and photographing and sharing and publishing this way can influence the way that you photograph generally. First and foremost, delete your Instagram. I think in order to break free and to experiment, one must get off of these platforms that trap you in a box. And so ever since I've essentially deleted my Instagram, oh man, I've been experimenting, playing, tinkering, and not really taking things too seriously, which is allowing me to experiment and is allowing me to break the rules intentionally. And so I find that composition, it's important, right? Composition is the foundation of a photograph. However, it doesn't need to always be the priority in street photography, where we're looking to essentially photograph the raw emotion of the street. And so I find that in order to break the rules, in order to experiment, in order to push the boundaries, one must master the basics of photography. And this is one of my limiting beliefs, but I'm here to share this with you because I don't want to promote lazy photography. I want you to go out there and become a competent photographer. I want you to go out there and practice daily with consistency. I want you to be persistent with your process and actually master the basics of photography. I think that every photographer should have the ability to articulate the chaos within the frame and to put order to the moments within a composition. In order to go out there and to break the rules, one must learn them first. And so here are some of the photographs that I've made over the past decade of traveling and working on my photography in various locations here in Philadelphia, on the front lines of conflict in Jericho, photographing at the sea in Napoli, Zambia, Africa, in the villages, and here at Bandra in Mumbai, where essentially I've allowed myself to break the rules because I've learned them. And so now when I'm photographing and experimenting with high contrast black and white, I have a foundational understanding of where to make certain relationships between subjects, moments, and things. But by focusing on the highlights and focusing on the details and crushing the shadows, I'm allowing myself to explore and to photograph in this unique way, where I believe one should break the rules because we are focusing on the emotion, because we're focusing on the raw, spontaneous energy of the streets. Where street photography, life itself, it's imperfect. And so perhaps embracing imperfection as perfection is the way forward to breaking the rules. And so sometimes the most chaotic scenes can become the most powerful because of the impact that they have, instead of the compositional elements of the visual game of putting together the foreground, middle ground, and background, where some things may be cut off, some moments may be unfiltered, some things may seem a bit wonky, but I believe that ultimately the emotion within the photograph is what we're seeking to uplift, and recognizing that sometimes the chips, they just fall as they may. And when we make a photograph, it derives through our gut. And that moment we press the shutter, things align intuitively. And it's not necessarily something that we can contrive. However, by observing the chaos of the streets and being there and being present, we can make these different relationships between these chaotic moments, between all the different people that are out on the streets. And I think there is something to be said about a composition that falls through our intuition, and something that happens naturally and instinctively, and something may not seem visually coherent in the moment that you look at the photograph, but as you observe street photography, you'll realize that a lot of the best work is not necessarily perfect. I find that by embracing the imperfection and embracing the moment itself and the content within my frame as the priority, I'm enhancing my ability to break the rules and to experiment. And so I believe that as much as we should master the basics first and have a foundation of making straight photos and understanding the fundamentals of composition, I also believe that studying the masters, studying work that's been done before us, can give us a bridge, give us this foundation to build upon. And so essentially I've been studying the work of Japanese photographers like Daido Moriyama, who use imperfection as a strength, who prioritize the feeling and the essence of the street over the clarity, challenging the traditional ideas of what good photography means. And so essentially I find that by looking at work that's been done before me and understanding those who have experimented and broken the rules intentionally, I can have a better understanding of where we can take things visually, and to push the boundaries and to break the rules. One must have these tools under their belt, the foundational principles of what makes a great photo, the understanding of what's been done before me, and then I can go out there and break the rules intentionally. And so I find that by looking at some of these books, looking at the Provoke movement, looking at Daido Moriyama's work here in Record 2, a book that I just recently picked up, I'm able to study some of the ways that photographers before me have used grain, grit, and that raw energy in the frames to elevate their street photography through breaking the rules and embracing spontaneity. And so I encourage you to also study photography in order to have an understanding of what's been done before you, and then building upon that. And so when you're photographing, I find that trusting your instinct and trusting your gut is the best way to make a composition, because ultimately composition, it derives through our intuition. And so allow the thing itself, allow the moment, the content, the gesture, the energy of the street be the reason you make the photograph, and not necessarily try to make it so perfect. And so I find that the best photos are sometimes a little bit more spontaneous and not necessarily contrived. And so follow your gut and respond to your instincts when you're photographing. If you see a beautiful moment, photograph. Don't worry about the exposure and the way in which the focus is set. Make sure that you have an understanding of how to create a photograph, but don't be too caught up and beat yourself up if things become a bit more unfiltered or a bit more imperfect, essentially. And so the blur, the grain, the overexposure, these things can actually add depth and intensity to our photographs, where motion blur can enhance energy and grain can evoke a sense of rawness in our photographs. And so I find that sometimes having a photo that's overexposed or even underexposed can create a unique mood. And this is something I seek to achieve through breaking the rules, is focusing on the emotion and focusing on the imperfection. I'm able to break the rules more intentionally. And so here in Queens, New York, I photographed at this scene, and you can see that it's a bit overexposed, but I focused on the moment itself. And there's this raw energy and this grit and this grain to the scene that captures the emotion of the street. And so when I break the rules, I make sure that I recognize that there is a reason I'm breaking the rule. You know, here in Paris at nighttime, I was focused on the moment of the woman on the bench, and I noticed the way in which she was gazing and looking with the gesture, and it was a really beautiful moment. And so the emotions were high, and there was something here that allowed me to break the rules, as it's low light and there's going to be a lot of chaos at the scene as people are moving in and out. And so by photographing at a low shutter speed, I was allowing myself to play with motion blur, to allow the grain, the movement, and the grit of the scene and the chaos unfold naturally as I honed in on the emotional impact of the moment itself. And so breaking the rules with intention, I believe, should be key to going out there and doing this thing, where I'll share with you now some case studies from my photography, breaking the rules in certain scenes. And so here is a chaotic layered shot where the composition was, it was secondary to the moment itself, where essentially I was interested in that woman there that I just circled in red, where she was sitting alone in the cafe, and I felt as though the emotion was high and there was something here to photograph, and I appreciated the gesture. However, the scene became a bit more sloppy and chaotic, as there's a lot of different subjects here that I'll circle in yellow that don't necessarily fit the composition so perfectly. However, there's something to be said about the balance in the framing, where the highlight detail on the left-hand side and the menu on the right-hand side give this sort of visual framing to the picture. But this happened very naturally, and the layers within the photograph happened through my intuition, and not something that I necessarily focused on in the moment, but I was simply responding to that emotion of the woman that was in the background and trying to layer her within the composition. I also find that blur it can create this energy and this emotion in the frame. And so sometimes I photograph with blur intentionally, where at this scene I found myself in a low light situation coming in and out of a church, and there were these nuns there giving out these pamphlets, and there was many people at the scene. And by capturing that raw energy through motion blur, I'm able to create a more impactful photograph. Off-center, overexposed images can also tell a stronger story. It doesn't necessarily need to be a very clear depiction of a person in the frame, centered, exposed perfectly, but something about overexposing and not necessarily having the perfect composition can actually enhance the impact of a photo. And so shoot with your instincts, embrace imperfection, try new techniques, expose for the highlights, crush the shadows, maybe overexpose. Shoot blurry photographs if you're shooting movement, and recognize that you have the freedom to explore, to experiment, and to evolve, and to go beyond the basic tradition of photography. And so this is one of the techniques that I use on the street very practically. I'm showing you from my window here how I'm exposing at the scene. And so I use the Ricoh GR3 with highlight weighted metering. I'm photographing with a high contrast black and white JPEG file baked into the camera. And when I photograph at certain scenes, of course, the camera, the metering is set for the highlights. And so in order for me to photograph this scene and to brighten the image, I essentially move my camera to the shadow area, half press my shutter, lock it in, and then I move my camera back towards the subject, back towards the moment, and make the photograph. And this allows me to very quickly on the street respond intuitively through playing with exposure and experimenting with either crushing the shadows and exposing for the highlights, or blowing out the highlights and overexposing my image. And while I have a lever on the back of my camera that I can simply adjust to create this effect, I find that by using this very particular technique that's unique to me, I've been able to photograph freely and experiment with things where this is a very quick and intuitive thing that I do on the streets, and allows me to achieve certain photographs like this one here that I made on Chestnut Street here in Philadelphia on a very cold winter day. And as I observed this scene, I noticed how this mirror was positioned within that trash can. And so the secret of this photo is the technique I use, right? And so at this scene, I noticed the beautiful light and the way it was just reflecting, and it was just incredible. I mean, this was an incredible day in this corner, and this woman came by, and she was going to light her cigarette. And at that moment, I was experimenting with the exposure, and I was trying to photograph it. And if I were to simply photograph that scene with the highlights and crushing the shadows, you wouldn't see this enormous glow and this effect within the frame. But by exposing for the shadows, by using that previous technique you just saw with my Ricoh, and then raising the camera back up and pressing the shutter at that moment, I was able to create something very visually interesting and impactful through exploration, experimentation, and breaking the rules. And there's another photograph here that I exposed for the highlights and crushed the shadows here at Penn's Landing at the Delaware River in Philadelphia, where I was standing atop of a ledge looking down towards the river, and the birds were actually quite far from me, and I was photographing with the Ricoh GR3, which is a 28mm lens. However, if you see the settings here in my camera, I have a 50mm crop. And you see that 50mm crop. So what I did was, I have on my what is it? The Wi-Fi button. On the Wi-Fi button, on the side of my camera, if I double click it, it goes to 50mm. And I also want to highlight here that I underexposed by one stop. And so there are some situations like this that I intentionally break the rules by cropping in the camera and underexposing. I was able to create a more dramatic effect in my image by making the birds look as though they're sort of positioned throughout this ambiguous, sort of mysterious location. However, of course, they're simply alongside a river. I found that by experimenting with the exposure, experimenting with the way in which I was photographing, using the crop feature in my camera, I was able to come home with a much more impactful photograph. And so I believe that at the end of the day, there is no 1, 2, 3 ABC on how to do things. Intuition is more important than following any formulas or making any logical decisions when you're in the streets. You know, don't be afraid to make mistakes, to fail, and to break through the process of breaking the rules, and just keep shooting, right? I find that by experimenting and going out there and shooting each day, you will naturally become more capable of breaking the rules with intention. And so go out there, explore the unknown. I encourage you to go out there and break the rules and to find your own way to play the game, as there are no rules, there are no guidelines in street photography. And this, to me, is one of the most beautiful and liberating things about this medium, is how endless it is and how many different ways there are for us to photograph. And so I find that this to be my way forward through breaking the rules intentionally, exploring and tinkering, and trying my best to evolve and to transform through the experimentation of my street photography. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.